Dr. Perry, I'm going to move to ask you now about a little about AIDS and your knowledge of AIDS. Do you recall roughly how or when you learned about AIDS for the first time?
No, I can't put a precise date on it, but my guess would be sometime in 1982, perhaps, from discussions with Mr. Watt and just general surveillance of the literature and so on. But I can't. I think my very early discussions with Mr. Watt was one of the ideas he had that it was CMV infection. It was a consequence of CMV infection, but that was pure speculation.
We know that in July 1982, there was reported cases of AIDS in haemophiliacs in the States, July 1982. And then later, I think December 1982, further reports in the MMWR report of a transfused baby or toddler in California. Would you have read the MMWRs or had them brought to your attention?
Yes, I would have either read it or appropriate abstracts from it would have been photocopied and circulated. That was part of the SNBTS document sharings before internet existed. That's how information was circulated around the SNBTS. So I regularly saw MMWR, yeah.
So in the second half of 1982, not necessarily immediately they were published, but those publications would have come to your attention?
I can't guarantee that, but it was certainly a regular feature of my background reading, as it were. And
do you recall, in general terms, I'm not asking here about specific meetings or specific dates, but do you recall how and when it became apparent that there might be a link with blood or blood products and an issue of potential significance for SNBTS and indeed for fractionators?
No, I think I would be guessing if I pretended that I did know exactly when that happened, but it would perhaps been around late 1982, early 1983. That there was increasing. I don't think there was ever a key event, a single event that triggered the complete understanding of AIDS and its etiology and epidemiology, but it would have been around that time. I think that the view that it was a blood-borne virus was hardening up, I think.
And then if we look at your witness statement, WITN 6920001. If we go to page 28 and look at the bottom of that page, I think you say, paragraph 79, I do not recall any specific practical actions being undertaken by PFC in response to early reports concerning AIDS, other than paying close attention to emerging UK, international and regulatory, particularly FDA, opinion. And then over the page, you refer in the second line from the top of the page to SNBTS and PFC staff regularly attending UK and international meetings and conferences in which AIDS increasingly featured in the scientific programmes and discussions. So I think it's right to understand from your statement that at this point in time, late 82 into 1983, there was nothing in particular that PFC did as a response to the emerging and increasing knowledge about AIDS.
I'm not sure when. I think the answer to that is no. They didn't do any. We didn't do anything in particular. I'm not quite sure when. I can't remember, although it's been discussed recently at the inquiry, when the first leaflets were proposed to be sent to donors and so on.
Yes, and that's a little later in 1983.
Later,
so
yes.
We see discussions emerging, taking place certainly in Scotland in May of 1983.
Yes, that's. My recollection, what we did do, but it wasn't in response to AIDS, it was in response to non-A, non-B hepatitis, which was established the SNBTS coagulation factor study group under Professor Cash. But and of course, had that been had early success, then it would have been applied to HIV risk as well as non-A, non-B risk.
We heard from Dr. Foster about his attendance at the World Federation of Haemophilia Conference in Stockholm in the middle of 1983. Did you attend that?
No, I don't remember going to that, no.
Now, a meeting you did attend, and which you referred to in your statement, is the meeting of Haemophilia Centre directors in October 1983. If we can look at the note that I think you made, or someone from PFC made, about that meeting, it's at PRSE 5040, please, Sunny. So we can see it's entitled Notes on the 14th Meeting of UK Haemophilia Centre Directors at Oxford RHA, 17th of October 1983. Looking at this now, is it your belief that this was your note?
I think it is, yes, I think so.
And then we can see it records major points of interest emerging from the morning session with brief discussions on BPL AT3 concentrate. Is that antithrombin?
Antithrombin 3, yes.
And then non-effective factor 8 concentrates. Yes. And then there's a recollection, there's an account of what Dr. Snape was saying about AT3. If we go to the bottom half of the page, we can see there the heading heat-treated factor 8 concentrate. And it records Dr. Snape seeking haemophilia directors' views on two options regarding heat-treated factor 8 products. The first option is dry heat, and you record no technical details were presented. Subject to demand, Terry Snape indicated such a product could be available within 2 to 3 months, would be available on the basis it's no worse than the existing product. And then this records, assuming this is your note, you asking whether any viral inactivation data was available on the process, to which Terry responded by saying that such data may be available in due course, but would probably follow the general availability of the product and therefore be retrospective. Do you have any recollection of that issue being discussed and explored?
I can't remember the actual question and answer exchange, clearly I asked the question about, this would have been model viral inactivation data, not patient data, or this would have been spiking samples with model viruses, and I think that's what I was probing Dr. Snape about.
And then we see the second option identified is pasteurisation, and then if we go over the page, I just want to pick up the first main paragraph on the page. It says, in general discussion of above options, Dr. Krask pointed out that limited experience Travanol of heated dry product was not encouraging. There also emerged a general fear and fateful acceptance that the production of non-infective products would lead to a reduction in availability of NHS concentrates, i.e. loss of yield. Terry seemed to reinforce this view, quoting figures of up to 25% loss in yield over the existing product. I pointed out that while hard data was not yet available, developments relating to other aspects of the overall manufacturing process upstream of any heating process may partly or fully offset any yield inherent in pasteurisation. I quoted in particular Peter's publication on zinc and calcium, that's presumably Dr. Foster.
Yes.
Neither Dr. Bolton, Dr. Ludlam or myself considered it appropriate to discuss publicly the details of our current clinical trial on heat-treated factor 8. So just pausing there, can you assist, first of all, with the general fear and fateful acceptance that production of non-infective products would lead to a reduction in availability of NHS concentrates? What was the issue or the concern there? Who was expressing fear or fateful acceptance? Was that the general attendees at the meeting?
I would imagine it would have been the Haemophilia Centre directors who were already suffering from shortages of NHS product, and perhaps also, I think, and it says that Terry seemed to reinforce this view, so I think Terry, representing BPL, reinforced that view that the output of BPL, if they were to heat treat their products, would fall by a further 25%. So it was, and the inevitable consequence of that would be for increased purchases of commercial products, whether heated or unheated, which would not have been a good outcome. So
And then why was it, looking at the last sentence of that paragraph, that you, Dr. Ludlam and Dr. Bolton, didn't think it appropriate to discuss publicly what was happening in terms of PFC's trial of heat-treated factor VIII?
Sorry, what was the date of this?
It's
this
17th
meeting?
of October 1983.
Oh, okay, okay. I think it was because clearly the details of our what is described there as our clinical trial. I think this was the ZHT, the PFC pasteurized product. Details of that had already been shared with BPL, but amongst only between BPL and PFL, and I think Dr. Bolton, Ludlam, and myself thought it was neither ready or appropriate to discuss this in a wider public forum. I'm not sure whether the trial at that stage had taken place or whether it was in planning.
And then the note continues, despite the unvalidated nature of BPL's short-term solution, there seemed to be a general feeling in favour of a heated dry product, since such a solution would do no harm. It was suggested that BPL manufacture a limited scale batch of heated dry product with a view to conducting a small clinical trial in virgin haemophiliacs, or at least those with no previous exposure to concentrates and who have normal LFTs. That appears to suggest the mood of the meeting favouring dry heated product over a pasteurised product. Is that the right way to read this note?
I think it was simply reflecting that the dry heat treated product, without really any evidence that it would be effective against non-A, non-B or any other unknown viruses, because we don't know their nature, would have been quicker. So in the sense, if there was any favour shown to the dry heat treated product, I think it was simply the time scale for its introduction. I think certainly from where I sat, most people felt that a pasteurised product was likely to be more efficacious in terms of virus kill over a wide range of viruses than quite modest dry heat treatment.
And is it right to understand that this meeting didn't lead to any change of approach or direction on the part of PFC's work? You continued with, when I say you, I mean PFC, continued with its pasteurisation project?
Yes, yes.
And then if we go to the bottom half of the page, we can see the afternoon session. It says comprehensive written reports were circulated attached. Well, I think that probably answers my earlier question to you about obtaining copies of the written reports. And then there's a reference to the situation in relation to the states. We can see at the bottom, or towards the bottom, it says total of 21 cases of transfusion-associated AIDS in the USA. And then if we go to the top of the next page, it says, crude interpretation of these figures provides the following risk statistics. Transfusion 1 in 500,000 at risk. Haemophiliacs 1.2 in 1,000 at risk. Conclusion, serious disease in haemophiliacs, a low possibility, ? I don't know whether you can, at this distance of time, say, Dr. Perry, but is that your interpretation of what's the figures that have been delivered, or is that you recording a discussion at the meeting about numbers at risk and the extent to which serious disease?
I think this is, they're certainly not my figures. I don't think I would have been in a position to do those calculations. I think these were the data that was presented. I have to say it was in many senses, as we know now, they were wildly off the mark, and simply because they were just taking numbers of known patients with AIDS and dividing that by the total population and in a sense projecting that as a risk, which clearly completely underestimated the number of patients that had seroconverted to HIV but had yet to be detected.
It wasn't dealing with risk at all, was it? It was dealing with perceived incidence.
It was an incidence calculation. You're right. Yes.
There's then a summary of the UK situation and reference to details of haemophiliac cases A1 and A4. Now, that's, I suspect, a reference to the individuals that we've referred to as the Cardiff case and the Bristol case, or Cardiff patient and Bristol patient. But in any event, do you have any recollection of discussions within PFC or within SNBTS about the fact that by October 1983 there were cases in haemophiliacs in the United Kingdom? Do you remember that being a subject of discussion and concern for SNBTS?
There were 2 cases, weren't there, in haemophilia
Yes.
patients? That's right. I can't remember whether. I'm pretty certain it will have been discussed. This was a report that went out to all my colleagues in PFC and certainly colleagues in RTCs. So it would have provoked discussion. I can't remember what that discussion was or what the outcome of that discussion might have been.
And then if we just look at the bottom of this page, we've got the heading hepatitis. NHS material is no better than commercial product with respect to disease transmission. In a small study using an accredited donor pool manufactured by BPL, 1 in 8 recipients have so far developed signs of non-A, non-B hepatitis. So far, this study is of 2 months' duration, and unfortunately, BPL cannot determine the pool size used to make the batch. Now, that first paragraph under the heading hepatitis, NHS material is no better than commercial product with respect to disease transmission, would be a fairly fundamental piece of information, would it not, for PFC, whose raison d'etre, as you've described it, has been very much domestic NHS concentrates are safer than commercial concentrates. Can you recall the discussion about that issue?
I think this relates to, unless my timing is wrong, but to the really quite key and seminal publication by Dr. Kernoff, who did detailed studies in patients on NHS product and on commercial product, and he found that I think something like 8 out of 9 patients on NHS product develop symptoms of non-A, non-B hepatitis, 100% for commercial product. And I think it's referring to that. So in my note, this is simply a shorthand referring to an appendix. So maybe there's more detail in the appendix, but I can't remember what that appendix actually contained. But if this meeting is from late 1983, I think it was certainly known by then that NHS products were not free from the risk of non-A, non-B hepatitis. They were believed, certainly in the early studies, to have lower severity of disease, and the clinical symptoms were shorter lived. Whether that turned out to be a valid observation, I don't know. So there were differences, but the idea that NHS products were safe was simply discounted as a result of this.
Can I then just ask you to look briefly at the formal minutes of the meeting, rather than your note? We'll find those at PRSC 0004440. We've got the date there again, 17th of October 1983, and your attendance is recorded on the second page. If we go to, I think it should be page 9, first of all. Sunny. I don't have a question for you in relation to this, Dr. Perry, but I'm just going to flag up that if we look at the penultimate paragraph on the page, it says, in reply to a query, Dr. Snape said that BPL hoped that not more than 10 to 15% of the factor VIII yield would be lost in the making of the virus-free products. I've just draw attention to that because I think your note had recorded a possibility of up to 25%. May not be inconsistent, but okay. I just wanted to draw that out. If we go to the next page, there's a discussion under the heading Any Other Business This is a passage the inquiry has looked at on a number of occasions, but it refers to Dr. Chisholm, who was the Haemophilia Centre Director in Southampton, identifying a problem of patients not wanting to take up commercial factor VIII, and a discussion about reversion to cryoprecipitate. Professor Bloom's response, no need for patients to stop using commercial concentrates because at present there was no proof that commercial concentrates were a cause of AIDS. And then Dr. Chisholm's recorded as saying she can get unlimited supplies of cryoprecipitate. Other directors report the same. And then it records an agreement that patients should not be encouraged to go over to cryoprecipitate for home therapy, but should continue to receive NHS or commercial concentrates in their usual way. Now, that's a debate perhaps of most direct interest to haemophilia clinicians. But is it one that you have any recollection of, that part of that meeting?
No, I don't recall the detail of the meeting, I'm afraid. I think I was certainly aware subsequently that this was beginning to be the case, but I'm sorry I can't elaborate on that at all.
Can I then just pick matters up at PRSE 0001885? We looked earlier at this letter from you to Dr. Cash in March of 1988, attaching a summary of events. I just want to ask you about a couple of passages now in the summary itself. So if we go to page 2, please, Sally. Under the heading Summary of SNBTS Response to HIV Contamination of PFC Coagulation Factors, which is the heading. If we can just zoom in at the top half of the page. What we've got identified there under the heading Factor VIII Heat Treatment Developments are as follows. Early 1982, in response to known hepatitis risk of Factor VIII concentrates, PFC initiated development programme for solution heating of Factor VIII. And I'm not going to ask you further about that at the moment. You then say BPL Elstree were exploring dry heat as an option on a collaborative basis with PFC. Now, in terms of 1982, what's the reference there to collaboration with PFC? What was it that PFC were contributing to BPL's dry heat work?
I think we were simply sharing information. I don't think there was a jointly agreed research program. I think it was simply an observation that PFC and BPL or PFL were exchanging information, particularly in terms of BPL's success or otherwise with their dry heat treatment program, and likewise the PFC with its pasteurization process.
And then the next item that you record, 1983-84, International Debate as to Causative Agent of AIDS. Consensus view that causative agent was an infectious agent, brackets virus, emerged in mid-1984. Now, why were you identifying the consensus view emerging in mid-1984, as you put it, as the next significant item here?
I don't really know. I think what I was reflecting was that there were other, at that time, perhaps maybe a little earlier than mid-1984, but there were other putative explanations in terms of T-cell abnormalities and repeated infusion of high quantities of protein through regular infusions and so on. And Professor Ludlam, he didn't advocate these. He simply suggested that these might either contribute or could conceivably, or there was evidence that they could conceivably be the case. I think I'm simply reflecting there from my own personal knowledge that by that time it was absolutely clear.
The next entry is October 84. That's the report from SEBTS of seroconversion of haemophiliac cohort, which we'll come on to in due course. And then October 84 still refers to PFC examining tolerance of the unheated stock to withstand dry heat. And then we have reference to the Groningen conference. can you just assist in unpicking this? It says, present at conference, Groningen. Were you present at that conference?
I was, yes.
Where first virus inactivation results were announced, US, from CDC/Qatar study, within 1 day of results being obtained. Is that saying that the announcement at the conference was within a day of CDC Qatar having that data?
It was. I think CDC had been invited to the meeting to give a presentation, but it was really presented as breaking news. They'd literally had those data passed to them from the US, and they took the opportunity to basically announce this really quite important finding.
If we just go back and look at the first half of that page as a whole, and bearing in mind this is what is being described as, I think it says SNBTS response, but it's I think really reflecting PFC's work, is it not? Because we know SNBTS were doing other things such as the AIDS leaflet and so on.
Yes, of course, yes.
It might be said this gives a picture that PFC itself didn't really focus upon any matters relating to AIDS until October 1984, when there was this combination of factors, Groningen, the discovery of the infected PFC batch. And it's only at that point that the PFC then focused upon the possibility of adapting its work to respond to the risk of AIDS. Is that a fair?
I think that's a reasonably fair summary of the position. We were still moving forward in the hope that the pasteurisation process would develop fairly quickly and be implemented routinely. It turned out that wasn't the case.
I'll come back to the events of autumn 1984, Dr. Perry, tomorrow. What I want to do just before we finish for the day is start looking with you at a topic relating to product warnings and labels. We won't, I think, finish that in the next 10 minutes, but
okay.
I think it's worth starting. So we can take that down, please, Sunny. So in terms of the PFC products that were issued to regional transfusion centres for onwards issue to health boards and to haemophilia centres, what were the different categories of information that accompanied that product? There'd be a label, is this right, on the vial itself? Yes. There'd be what's, I think, sometimes described as a leaflet or sometimes described as an insert. Are they the same thing? Or are they
yes, they would have. Certainly in the early 1980s, there would have been a leaflet or a product insert included with each product, which was typical of the industry generally, and it still is.
And was there anything else? Was there anything else external or by way of information on packaging?
There was key info. If the products were contained in an outer carton, which they often were, because for instance, the Factor VIII product was, I think it latterly was supplied as 10 vials of Factor VIII and 10 vials of water for reconstitution in a single container, a multi-dose, as it were, a container. But even when it was supplied as a single product, there would have been really mandated by pharmacopoeia monographs and regulations that there was certain minimum information that you had to put on the label, on the outer packaging, and in the product insert leaflet. I'm sure you'll explore it more, but the product insert leaflet at that stage was primarily directed at professionals, not patients.
Yes, we're going to explore with all these issues. In terms of responsibility at PFC, whose responsibility, either in terms of department or individual, was the working out what information should be included on the insert or the leaflet or on the vial?
That would have been the quality department would have been responsible for that. Not necessarily for its procurement, but the procurement would have been done, I think, at that stage in the early 80s by by the manufacturing department as part of its responsibility for procuring raw materials and so on. And I think also Professor Cash, acting as medical director or advisor, would have been asked either formally or informally by Mr. Watt in the early 1980s and subsequently by myself to sign off the precise text. Although it was largely informed by, I noted I was provided with a series of pharmacopoeia monographs here, and labelling on vials is often prescribed by the pharmacopoeia monograph.
Yes, and we'll certainly look at that. And that really leads to the next question I wanted to ask you, which is, what was the decision-making process, as far as you can recall, about what should be included on the vial or the leaflet? Now, I appreciate you joined in 1981, so you wouldn't have been around in 1978 when the licence application was
sure.
first submitted, yeah. and the text of an insert or leaflet was identified. But in terms of your own knowledge from 1981 onwards, can you recall what the process was? Was it just a case of looking at the pharmacopoeia and using that language, or?
I think it was the pharmacopoeia and other regulations that existed that prescribed. For example, when you submitted a licence application, an important part of the licence application was what you were going to put on the label. So the precise wording and even the size of the respective messages were authorised as a result of being granted a marketing authorisation. So we would have gone through that process, and you're right to say that when I joined in 1981, I'd had no impact or input into that, but I think, I can't remember exactly when, maybe 1982, I did a review of the packaging, particularly for coagulation factors, and within that review I would have certainly reviewed the precise wording and made any changes that were necessary, and had that approved by the PFC director and his medical advisor, who was Professor Cash.
We'll look at the language of the pharmacopoeia in the morning rather than now. But just in terms of the input or involvement of the licensing authority, would it be right to understand that what happened is PFC would submit its application, which would contain, as you say, draft wording, contain, and we'll look at an example in the morning, a leaflet or insert which had certain information about hepatitis on it.
Yes.
But it would be submitting that as part of the product application process.
Yes.
Might or might not then be approved. But the licensing authority didn't itself come up with a required form of wording. Is that right?
They periodically they may have, in response to any manufacturer submitting a license application, there might be some form of words, particularly to do with the product inserts, where different companies use different wording. It's not standardised. There's not one size fits all, and they may well come back and ask for changes, or a different emphasis, and so on. I think our product inserts were fairly simple and fairly straightforward, but it is the case that the licensing authority could come back and
Yes.
ask you to change something.
Yes, no, I accept that. I think my question was a slightly different one. The licensing authority didn't itself produce a form of wording for use on factor VIII concentrates. It would respond to what was being submitted to it by PFC or BPL or ARMA or whoever it might be.
That's right. But if we called our product human anti-haemophilic factor, BP. So that would automatically trigger the licensing authority to look at the BP monograph and check whether our wording complies with the monograph.
And then just in terms of who the audience was for the inserts or the labels on the vials or so on, can I just ask you to look at an extract from your evidence to Penrose, PRSE 00006038. if we start at, so this is your evidence on the 24th of June 2011. If we start on page 95, I just want to pick it up from the bottom half of the page from line 14 onwards. You were asked essentially the same question that I'm asking you. Who were those pack inserts designed for? Is it for the doctors or for the patients or who? And then this is your response. It's a good question. Certainly nowadays you have a thing called a product information leaflet and a technical information leaflet, and they have different target audiences, and they're written in completely different ways. Just pausing there, Dr. Perry, do you know when that particular change or...
I think it was the early 1990s.
And then you say, at that time, I think the answer to your question is that they were targeted in the way they were written, certainly at prescribing doctors. They gave some basic characteristics, but also some of the... And then over the page, please, Sunny. Information was very accessible to lay people in terms of how you reconstituted the product, how you used it, and so on. A question was part of the purpose of the package insert to give information about the possibility of there being risks of viruses being transmitted through the product. Answer, the package inserts that we had in common with the rest of the industry certainly included warnings that, I think we were very general in our warnings, saying this product, although the plasma is tested for hepatitis B, it cannot be assumed to be free of infectious risk or words to that effect. So yes, it was designed to give a warning to both patients and certainly to doctors. But doctors already knew this, and then we continue with your answer at 16, that these products carried a risk associated with them. So the document that was included with each vial was really part of that process, but also to satisfy our essentially legal obligations within the pharmaceutical industry. Even then, the industry was required for prescription medicines to have some sort of information leaflet associated with them. So it would appear from that answer you're suggesting it's... Is this right? Predominantly aimed at doctors, but also with a view to providing information to patients?
I think they were designed and designed primarily for doctors and indeed pharmacists. I think the product insert leaflets at that time were there to inform not only the prescribing doctor, but if there was a pharmacy. For our products, that wasn't the case because they weren't supplied through pharmacies. But as a general principle, these leaflets were there to provide important information to both prescribers and pharmacists who were fulfilling prescriptions. I think I always took the view, and I think others did, that these products were supplied with the product, and patients on home therapy would have been supplied with the whole package, so they would have had the leaflet, and many of them may well have read it. But I think the precise wording was prescribed by the requirement to satisfy the professional requirements for the product rather than the individual patients. Those leaflets came later.
Okay. Well, perhaps we can pick that up in the morning by looking at the actual wording, which will take a little time, so I won't embark upon it now.
Yes, well, we'll take a break now, then until 10 o'clock in the morning, if you please.
Thank you.
So 10 o'clock in the morning.